It's about taking things that seem obvious and making them into questions. Our politics would be really exciting if young people were to be part of it, raising fundamental questions that politicians don't ask. You know, so for example, let's say, for example, we believe in democracy. Never hear a word more often uttered than democracy. Majority rules. Okay, the first question I have is, does the majority get to rule on everything? Let's say the majority decides that next week you should be shot. Is that a good thing? Because we all decide, we had a vote, we just decided we'd like to kill you. Why not? Because majority rule is limited by your rights. Right? Now let's take a more difficult question. Let's say the majority decides to find one man, Bill Gates, and take all his money. Does the majority have the right to do that? Does the majority have the right to have a vote and say, Bill Gates has $51 billion, that's way too much. Let's leave him with $1 billion and take 50. Do we have the right to do that in the name of democracy? And if...
I think those of us who support affirmative action must take care to thoughtfully respond to the question posed by Mr. D'Souza about anti-Semitism. Yeah. His answer suggests that if you support affirmative action, you must therefore abandon all notions of merit and support all forms of preference. That is not true. Affirmative action is not an all-or-nothing system. I am no more in favor of letting unqualified individuals into this university than Mr. D'Souza is. I am merely saying that each and every one of us has qualifications that don't show up in grades and test scores, and we are more than merely numbers.
Thank you. Mr. D'Souza?
That is the difference.
Thank you. Mr. D'Souza?
Professor Wu's whole argument comes down to this. We have preferences for in-state residents. We have preferences for alumni kids. We have preferences for athletes. What's wrong with preferences based upon race? Earlier he said, these preferences do not confer stigma. Well, I know I went to Dartmouth and we had what was called the athletes' table, at which I saw 350-pound guys eating 12 eggs for breakfast, and I assure you there was the stereotype of the dumb jock. So preference in a non-racial context does confer stigma. Here's another point. I'm against alumni preferences, and I would ask Professor Wu that if he wants to be consistent in defending merit, why don't we agree to have a coalition that would abolish alumni preferences and racial preferences both? But here's my point. He is defending these forms of nepotism, alumni preferences, in-state residences. He's not against them. What he's saying is that you've got all these guys feeding at the public trough. The alumni kids because they have money. Brooke Shields because she's Brooke Shields. Ted Kennedy's son gets into Harvard even though you and I might consider him disadvantaged. Nevertheless, here's my point. Here's my point. He's saying, his argument is that because we have other forms of nepotism or favoritism, why don't we have racial nepotism too? And my point is, I am arguing we want to move away from the nepotistical society. I'm not denying that there are forms of preference. I'm not denying that. But there is a special invidiousness, and the court recognizes this, to racial preferences. If I had a restaurant, and I said, no one can eat in my restaurant who doesn't wear shoes, is that legal? That's legal. On the other hand, if I say, no one can eat in my restaurant who's black, that's illegal. That's illegal. And so my point is, race is not the same thing as other forms of preferences. There is, for good historical reasons that Professor Wu himself refers to, a special invidiousness attached to race.
Thank you. Let's just...
All right, this question is for Mr. D'Souza. I just have a pretty simple question. Is racism dead in America? Because if racism is dead, then what you're saying is right. We don't need affirmative action. We don't need all these other preferential, as you say, different things like that. But if you can honestly say to this audience and say to the rest of the audience watching on C-SPAN that racism is dead, then I think you'd probably be laughed out of this auditorium here. Now, this is not to attack you or anything like that, but I'm just I would just want to know if you think or believe that racism is dead.
I'll
Because-
answer your question, but may I pose a quick one to you?
Yes.
Is anti-Semitism dead in America?
No, it's not.
And should Brown have preferential programs for Jews?
I wouldn't be against it.
You think that Brown University should have preferential programs to let Jews, to increase the number of Jews in the student body?
I said I wouldn't be against it. Brown is a university that wants to be more culturally diverse.
Let me ask you this. Do people in this society have a prejudice against people who are hugely overweight?
Yes, they do.
And do you think Brown University should have a preferential program to let such
Excuse
people
me.
in?
Stay with it. Stay with it. Stay with it. Sorry. Please stay with it.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I have answered it all too well. Racism is
Sorry,
not bad.
sorry, Mr. D'Souza. Please reply if you'd like.
Wait. You have not answered my question.
I'm going to.
Look, like, you were talking
answer
about...
is
Sorry,
no.
wait, excuse me. Let's just sort of stop for a moment. If you'd like to ask a question now, your last question, please do so.
This is it. You're at the Olympic Games, right? And you're saying how it's all equal. Well, in America, and I hate to say it, but the white man has a 50-yard head start. And affirmative action makes that playing field just a little bit leveler. And if you're saying that racism is dead in America, then you're wrong. And I just want you to answer that question.
Thank you.